Thank you all very much for coming in today and hearing my talk. For a change, I won't be talking about bad ectoparasites or anything like that, so I could have tied into the wildlife disease ecology. But instead, what I'm going to be talking to you today about is the work I've been doing with biocontrols, in particular biocontrol associated with the control of saltcedar along our riparian corridors and the way it affects those ecosystems. So today's update is basically going to be talking about the control of 3 different saltcedar biocontrols that we have in the area and how they've been doing along the Rio Grande River as well as the Pecos. So to start this out, I'd like to kind of introduce a little bit idea of the project and what it was. I was first introduced to this project back in 2006 when USDA was interested in trying to work on biocontrol of saltcedar, as saltcedar had created this beautiful monoculture across the riparian areas. It basically was choking out all the rest of the vegetation that was found out in this region along the waterways. And as folks know, if you start to get a well-developed monoculture, just one solid plant mass coming through an area, it reduces the plant biodiversity. Well, if you reduce the plant biodiversity, you're going to reduce the insect biodiversity. You reduce the bird biodiversity. You reduce the mammal biodiversity. And this created a cascading problem. So the goal was to knock saltcedar back, allow other things to come in its place, reestablish a greater degree of biodiversity, and let the ecosystem go back to the way it was. Now, ironically, saltcedar was originally introduced in 1823 as an erosion control plant. It did a great job at holding the soil down, so great that it took over everything else. So it was one of those oopses that took place years ago that now we get to go through and try to correct. It spread through most of the western riparian areas, and as you can see in the lower picture, the Rio Grande would get rather dominated by it, and I even have a picture of the Pecos River here around Ira Ann from the 70s, showing how dominant saltcedar got in these areas. Now, to work toward this, the USDA ARS division worked on trying to find various different biocontrols and organisms that would eat and feed on saltcedar, but not feed on other things. To have a successful biocontrol, you don't need it to become a new rampaging problem in itself. There have been enough examples in the past of things that, got away from us. The goal was not to do that again. And this program seems to have been one of those that has not created a huge long-term problem. And I'm very happy to be a part of it. Now, they went to the original areas where saltcedar is found, which is Europe and Asia, collected individuals from Tunisia, Crete, Uzbekistan, etc., and collected all of these saltcedar leaf beetles of the genus Diabria. And originally we thought they were all one species. Upon additional genetic and molecular work, it's been determined that there were 4 different species, and we had since worked on getting them established. The first work on this was done in Colorado and then spread into Utah. For Texas, the first work we had was done in the Big Spring area, and then we worked in incorporating Big Bend National Park, the Rio Grande River from Lajitas and the state park all the way up to Candelaria and then beyond. So the beetles that we worked on putting in were the northern tamarisk beetle, in small part the Mediterranean beetle, which was elongata, and then the subtropical tamarisk beetle, sublineata. The northern tamarisk beetle worked very well up in the Panhandle region of Texas, and they got that established around Amarillo. From Amarillo, that has since spread to Oklahoma and even has a few population that made it up into Kansas. But around here in the Rio Grande, we focused on the Mediterranean, the larger, and the subtropical tamarisk beetles. When we originally worked to get these established, we had all 3 of these. We set them up in cages inside sleeved systems to keep them controlled and keep them in a monitored situation to make sure they would grow, replicate, and also only feed on what we were putting them on. When we're doing this, we'd be monitoring and tracking egg masses, larvae, as well as trying to see pupa whenever you could see them, and then look at the state of these as they reproduce. When they're reproducing and growing and just dominating, as we can see here, we can see that they can become quite numerous on their, this is touchy. How did we get into Kelby's talk? There you go. We can see that they can become extremely numerous and can almost be dripping off the trees when you start seeing large numbers of these larvae occurring. So for monitoring these beetles, when we first started this in 2006, we just started with 3 cages. From those 3 cages, we then had them grow, develop, establish. We were able to release them in 2008 with permission from the Mexican government as well as our own governmental officials. And then we started to track and follow them across the landscape. 2009, we started getting some decent activity beginning to move, but not a whole heck of a lot. We had the Alameda Marsh, where we had a whopping 2 hectare area covered, which wasn't a whole heck of a lot. By 2010, the population really took off, and we started to cover river miles of areas. The population really exploded and took off. When we did that, we started first seeing them on the adjacent trees. Then we started seeing the larvae breeding and the populations really growing and swelling. And you'd start seeing trees actively getting completely defoliated. When you'd see the trees defoliate and get this nice reddish-brown color, all the live vegetation had been eaten off of them, and you basically are left with the sticks behind. Now, you can also see in this picture, off to the side, the next tree next to it's beginning to brown a little bit. It's also being attacked by these beetles. So the beetles would move and physically spread like a wave across the landscape. As this happened, they could start to truly decimate and wipe out the saltcedar in this area. Now, here's the kick about saltcedar. Anyone who's ever dealt with saltcedar knows that it's a very resilient plant, and it's a tough bugger to kill. You have to defoliate this tree 4 to 5 times a year to start knocking it back, and you need to do it for about 3 to 5 years before you'll actually get any dieback on the stuff. So this is a long-term process. The other thing to realize is that saltcedar, the whole point of this biocontrol is not to completely eradicate saltcedar, it's to knock it back to more acceptable levels so other things have a chance of living. A good biocontrol is not an eradication, it's a control system. The whole idea is that this will be continually doing long-term management. We saw this population really take off in 2012 through 2015. Those were our really good hot years for this. And then we started seeing populations kind of drop off. As the wave of beetles continued to move north along the river heading toward New Mexico, the populations down here started to slack off. We started seeing lower numbers. From these lower numbers, we continued to see activity along our stretch of the river as well as getting into New Mexico. But we just didn't see the numbers even into the 2000s that we had used to see. They're not occurring in the swarming densities, but we still get active patches of defoliation and activity, and we have seen a greatly reduced amount of saltcedar in these areas where we see other things growing in. Now, I did mention this was a 3 biocontrol talk. I spent all the time talking about the Diabria beetle because that's what we released and that's what we work with. However, when you're moving saltcedar and such around and you're trying to deal with things, as these things are introduced, as things moved around, other things crept in. And therefore, we had the introduction of the tamarack scale, as shown here on the far side. It was first found and located here in 2015. We're still seeing it today. It gets on these plants and starts beginning to do a lower level of defoliation, generally up to 30%, although most of the time it's around 10 to 15% defoliation. So it's not really killing the trees, but it is weakening the trees. And a good case of scale will prevent potentially leaf regrowth, and in particular, what I like, it tends to cut down the likelihood of flowering, and flowering is what's getting you more saltcedar in the future. The other insect we have here is a splendid tamarack beetle. This is something that showed up originally in Arizona, dropped down to Mexico, spread across the border of Mexico, then jumped back into Texas again. We started seeing it in 2015 around the Colorado Canyon site at Big Bend Ranch State Park, and since we have found it up into Potter County in Nevada, Oklahoma, Utah, California, Mexico. It's all over the place. We found in quite a few of our counties out here in the Trans-Pecos. Now, we're continuing to do work and monitoring of this beetle along the area. In particular, I've been monitoring defoliation along the Rio Grande. I go and check at least several times a year, still doing branch counts of egg masses, larvae, and adults, and looking at percent defoliation. I have noticed an increased amount of weevil and scale activity as well as some of these beetles. But the thing is, I'm also noticing that where you see scale, you typically don't see a lot of weevils. Where you see weevils, you tend to not see a whole lot of scale. And where you see either one of these, you tend not to see the beetles. The beetles like their trees independent of these other biocontrols. So there might be some resource partitioning or exclusion because of them, and that interaction, that ecology is something I'm interested in looking at, seeing why are they not necessarily all hammering on the same tree. Now, along the Pecos did work to try to get these established back in the early 2000s. It did not quite take for whatever reason. and we're working on with the Friends of the Pecos to try to reestablish this activity again. Toward this end, I was scouting out sites along 24 to this year, looking for beetle activity. I have found scale and weevils, but none of the saltcedar leaf beetles. This past summer in 2005, I worked to collect some beetle larvae and adults from the Rio Grande, where we did have some large dominant populations, and tried to do some reintroductions to these things once again. So far as of 2026, I have not seen an established population of these beetles. We're still looking at possibly doing another attempted reintroduction and drop a few more off, but we have seen along the Rio, around the Pecos at least, a fair amount of the weevil activity and the scales. I got 2 pictures of those up there. And along the Rio Grande, I want to point out that although we don't have the swarms that we used to, you can still see some pretty good clumping of larvae in certain areas, and in certain places, particularly this is in Arroyo, I was sampling east of Presidio, you can see good patches of defoliation of the saltcedar where these things are still coming in and working and eating those plants very effectively. So we're still getting active biocontrol, we're still having them work and become part of this ecosystem, and hopefully getting saltcedar to be a little bit less dominant and give other things a chance to really increase our biodiversity and the health of our ecosystem as a whole. With that, I'd like to thank all my current and previous funding partners in this project. Most currently, Friends of the Pecos has been giving us a lot of help and support toward this, but also support from the Meadows Research Institute, Sul Ross State University, the Rio Grande Research Center, and other partners as well. Thank you very much for your time and attention, and if possible, I'll be able to answer any questions you guys have.
Are you seeing other species lethality, or are they remaining your...
These biocontrols seem to be very good at eating saltcedar and being very selective in their feeding. Back around 2010, 2011 was when the real swarm of these beetles were moving across the landscape, and there was one sister species that did get hit by the Tamarix leaf beetle, and it was Tamarix aphylla, the aethel tree. Aethel trees are the closest living relative. They are also an introduced species. They are not native to here. So they did eat and feed on aethel, but they have a 30% feeding and breeding affinity to aethel trees. They don't reproduce nearly as effectively on aethel. The next closest relative they have is the Frankensinia, and they can't survive more than 1% of breeding on Frankensinia. All the rest of the native plants, if you find them on it, it's because they're sitting there taking a break before they move and jump onto something else. They just can't feed on cotton, corn, cottonwood trees, or anything else. So they are very specific to the physiology of saltcedar, and they need the chemicals found in that particular Tamarix to be able to complete their life cycles. So they are very exclusive, and that's one of the lovely, beautiful things of this biocontrol system. There was a question in the back.
Are the native plants taking advantage of what's happening to the saltcedar?
We are seeing more native plant or reintroduction. Unfortunately, this project does not have a revegetation aspect associated with it, where we're not actively trying to replant and put in desert willow or anything like that. I wish we could, but I don't have the funding toward those means. But we have seen other native plants coming into these areas. Some of the places where we first established these beetles, the Alameda Creek area, some spots along Big Bend Ranch State Park, and even in Big Bend National Park, where this project was established, we have seen an increase in native and other local vegetation. Unfortunately, we also see an increase of other disturbed plant vegetation coming in as the landscape gets broken up. Whatever seeds are in that seed bank of the area are going to start coming up. So we've also seen an increase in things like baccharis, tree tobacco, and stuff like that coming in. But on the plus side, I haven't seen like a massive swarm of arundo or anything like that sweeping in its place.